Hello everyone. Hello and welcome to our next session. Join us now as we welcome our panelists, Ruth Faden, founder of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, and Philip Franklin Wagley, professor of biomedical ethics, Jeremy Greene, professor at the Johns Hopkins University, and Ketil Slagstad from the Institute of History and Medicine and Ethics in Medicine, Charité, Berlin. Together, they will explore the power and impact of diagnostic labels on our society, shedding light on the history, normalization, and stigma surrounding sexual and gender minorities. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We are just delighted to see so many of you. We were worried that there might be a little conference fatigue, but you're all here, and we're so pleased. All right. So let's get going. No professionals have done more for mental health and advancing the mental health of people than psychiatrists and psychologists, and we all know this. But the impact of psychiatry on the well-being and the rights of some groups in society has been, shall we say, complex. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to explore this complexity, this complex history, in the specific context of sexual preference, gender identity, and the social role of women. So this is a session devoted to history. We're going to try to learn a bit from the past so that we can better understand the present and hopefully improve the future. I cannot think of any better panelists to inform us in this journey than Dr. Jeremy Greene and Dr. Ketil Slagstad. They are two leading historians of medicine, and they are also themselves physicians. If we had had more time, it would have been wonderful to have joined on the panel members of the communities that are most affected by the history that will be discussed. Unfortunately, we have only 20 minutes for our part, so that's not possible. But we urge you to attend a session later this afternoon called Learning with Love, and it features a conversation between a trans person and his mother. So please join that later. So here's how the session will go. I'm going to moderate a conversation, a dialogue, if you like, between Jeremy, Ketil, and myself. And that will go for about, at this point, 17 minutes and 48 seconds. We have a counter here. At that point, we're going to switch to questions from all of you. As has been said many times during this remarkable conference, this conference is about all of us attendees. And it's most important and most gratifying to hear your questions and your comments. So we hope we will have time for at least a few of them. With that, let's get started. And Jeremy, could you begin with some kind of big picture thoughts?
Sure. So thanks so much, Ruth. It's such a pleasure to be here today and take part in this remarkable conference. And as a physician who works in a community health center in East Baltimore in the United States, and as a historian, I find myself spending a lot of time thinking about diagnoses and the kind of work that diagnoses do for better and for worse in both mental health and in advocacy for minoritized populations. And so I want to start with a moment, because oftentimes history works well in narratives. And I'll start with a day, which is December 15th, 1973. And it's just a show of hands. Does anyone know why I'm mentioning that date? So December 15th, 1973 is the day that the American Psychiatric Association changed 81 words in the what was called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM, and undid homosexuality as a pathology and reclassified homosexuality as a variant, a normal variant of human existence. Now, so this is a remarkable day, right? And on the one hand, it's a foundational milestone in the history of queer rights in the United States and really around the world. But on the other hand, it was a deeply destabilizing moment for the field of mental health in many ways. So if you think about this, in the early 1970s, there was a very strong anti-psychiatry movement of folks like the author Thomas Szasz, who saw all mental illnesses as social constructions, and for whom psychiatry was really a form of wielding social power over populations defined as deviant. And so in this context, the undoing of a disease that had been on the books for a century was also very threatening to the broader efforts of prioritizing mental health in the world. And it's important to realize that this change in the American Psychiatric Association was the result of years of work by a small group of gay psychiatrists with varying degrees of being out or not being out and meeting together or meeting in secret, working against the grain. About 90% of psychiatrists at the time believed homosexuality was a pathology. But that it really was a work much more so of queer activists outside of the field of psychiatry. So if we think of the Stonewall riots in 1969 as a foundational moment in the American gay rights movement, this is 69, and by 1970, the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in San Francisco became the target for gay rights activists who really disrupted the meeting, took it over, did it again in 1971, did it again in 1972. So this change in 1973 doesn't just come from inside the field of psychiatry.
So wait a minute, Jeremy, are you telling us that the psychiatrists were always the bad guys? I mean, is that...
Well, yeah,
I'm just trying to figure out what the full import
crowd
is.
here, yeah.
So,
well, yes.
I'm sure we've got some psychiatrists in the room, so just saying.
It's yes, and no. And I think it's important to think about both of these things, right? Because I know for any of you who wants to know more about this particular story, there's a wonderful podcast by This American Life, American National Public Radio, called 81 Days, that details the many complex positions that different gay psychiatrists inside of the APA had and their complicated relationships to the broader visible gay rights movement. But I think what we need to understand is that even many psychiatrists that were defending the pathologization of homosexuality in the 70s, and even practicing conversion therapy, believed themselves to be acting as allies to their homosexual patients. And it's hard to sit with how a group of people that believed themselves to be forces for progressive change can now be the villains in this narrative. But especially when it was seen as the only alternative they could conceive of to a homosexuality disease is the only alternative to homosexuality as a moral failing or homosexuality as a criminal act. And we need to remember that right now, as we sit here in this room, there are, to my last count, 64 countries around the world in which homosexuality is still illegal, right? And while several countries in recent years, Singapore, for example, Barbados, have taken those laws off the books, there are other countries, Nigeria, Uganda, in which we've actually seen more of a crackdown on those laws. And so historian Bert Hansen has looked at the complexity by which early American psychiatrists in the late 19th century, when they were creating the category of homosexuality as a pathology, believed themselves to be acting sympathetically to create an alternative to the criminalization of the field. And I'll quote Bert Hansen. He says that their case notes, when published, offered thousands of uncertain people an identity, a way to think of themselves as fundamentally different, but neither immoral nor vicious. So it really is yes and no.
It's a very complicated history and relationship then. So the idea here is in pathologizing homosexuality, the allyship came from essentially providing an alternative to either homosexuality as sin or homosexuality as crime.
Yes.
So now we get homosexuality as a disease, which has its own problems, many problems. So with that, I've been wanting to get you into the conversation for a bit now, watching the clock go, Ketil. There's a lot to the story that is less well known, not that what Jeremy has told us is so well known. And some of it's very European. Could you?
I think it's always good to de-Americanize this perspective sometimes, both in the history of psychiatry and in the history of queer people more generally. Actually, we talked about Stonewall. There was a gay activism movement 100 years earlier in Germany. I want to mention two people in particular. So it was firstly Karl Heinrich Ulrich, who was a lawyer, mid-19th, late 19th century, who campaigned against criminalization laws against homosexuality. And, at that time, there was no concept of homosexuality, so he referred to himself as Ordning, or a female soul in a male body. And those writings were picked up by psychiatrists and turned into psychiatric diagnosis. And so that's an example of pathologization, right? The second figure I wanted to mention was Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a Jewish doctor, a gay man, and a sexologist. And in 1897, he founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, campaigning, mobilizing scientific knowledge for the decriminalization of homosexuality. He campaigned for the rights of queer people in Germany at that time and founded in 1919 the Institute of Sexology. The Institute of Sexology he produced certificates for trans people so that they could walk freely on the street without the risk of being arrested. He offered the first gender-affirming therapies with hormones and surgeries in the 1920s and early 1930s. And he created an immense library that constructed the largest library of literature on queer people in the world. As a gay man, homosexual, sexologist, and a Jew, he was not in favor when the Nazis came to power in 1933. Right? So the first thing the Nazi student movement did in 1933 was to march into his institute. They demolished it, they tore out all the books, and they burned it on the public book burning. And I think there is a very clear parallel from the Nazis burning books about queer people in 1933 to the banning of books in American libraries today. The parallel is some people are not supposed to be seen in the public.
It's an extraordinary history. It was not known to me, and I'm suspecting not known to many of you as well. So thank you very much for that. And I cannot imagine what it must have been like for that man at that time. Ketil, could you say a little bit more? Because you've talked to us about gay people and also about trans people. Can you talk about how this pathological sort of approach and the depathologicaling of these categories have different implications and took different paths for the activists in these two communities?
Right, because I think it's a very complex and ambivalent story, because on the one hand, the labels offered a scientific labeling in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, away from crime, away from sin. It was better to be sick than criminal or sinful, right? On the other hand, the psychiatric labels legitimized throughout the 20th century harmful practices such as sterilization, castration, conversion therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, and neurological high-dose neuroleptics to change people's identities, right? In the 1970s, you see a shift because the gay movement and the first gay activist organization in Greece was founded in 1976. And with the Stonewall rise, I mean, there is no longer need for the label from psychiatry to have legitimacy in society, right? It's different for trans people because, on the one hand, you know that diagnoses are the entry ticket to the healthcare system. So when the World Health Organization reformed the diagnostic classification system in the 11th edition, the last 10 years, trans advocates were wary that removing the diagnosis completely would remove their only entry ticket to get health services that many trans people rely on for transition, right? Yes. So they ended up removing the highly stigmatizing diagnostic label of gender identity disorder. Think about that. I mean, your identity in itself is disordered. It was removed from the chapter on psychiatric illnesses and replaced with a new diagnosis of gender incongruence in a chapter on sexual health. So now it's regarded as a human variation that sometimes is in need of medical help, along with in the same category as pregnancy. Yeah,
it's a very important analogy in many respects and a segue, right, from pregnancy to my question to Jeremy. But I hope it's clear to everyone this importance of holding on to some way of being able to claim a right to trans medical care. And it's very difficult to do that in most countries if there isn't some kind of diagnostic label that enables the healthcare system to deliver this treatment. So this is a major step forward, but the story is by no means finished. So maybe not so artful transition, but Jeremy, could you broaden this discussion about pathology and mental health and its relationship to structural justice and social and political equality to now other disadvantaged groups and their struggle for equality? And let's start with the context of patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism. So how has psychiatry been a force that's retrograde, and where has it been an ally for the interests of women?
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity to broaden this, because really we're talking about is power, right? And that the naming of a diagnosis is a form of power, and it's often been allied with understanding medical authority as a form of patriarchal authority. And so, women are not a gender minority in the world, right? That's a nonsensical statement, but women are certainly minoritized in positions of power, right? Certainly historically within the medical profession, right? And that psychiatric diagnosis has played a role in this, right? From the invocation of hysteria, right, through the invocation of more recent categories like PMS, right, or premenstrual syndrome. There's ways of using diagnostic structures to delegitimize women's claim to equal participation in the franchise, the right to vote, in serving office, in participation in institutions of higher education and the learned professions. And so it takes time to extract the role of medical knowledge, right? But every wave of feminism, right, first, second, third, right, has had to take on the patriarchal basis of medical knowledge and what becomes seen as commonplace restrictions. And I guess one can look in some complicated ways in which this pharmaceutical sphere intersects with this as well. So many of you may remember in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there's a blockbuster marketing of tranquilizers, of minor tranquilizers, like Valium. They become popularly known as mother's little helpers, and they're very much associated with a highly gendered diagnosis of anxiety disorders, right? So this is a diagnostic category.
Jeremy, would you say that's sort of the freshened up, updated version of hysteria, or?
Well, in many ways. I mean, history is all warp and weft and continuity and change. Yeah. But what's so interesting in this is that many psychiatrists, in prescribing mother's little helpers, believe themselves to be helping the person in front of them continue in the stresses of a job in an equitable workplace, or getting by in a domestic life in the face of gendered violence in the home, right? And at the same time, they're also, health feminists say, well, no, you're providing a Band-Aid that helps to prop up an unjust system that fundamentally helps to potentiate the structural violence that actually causes this. So is adjustment disorder, which is what hysteria becomes called, are you supposed to adjust to a terrible system, right?
We're supposed to get used to being oppressed, right? That is the right approach to mental health. So we have time, I think, for one quick segue, and then I want to give Ketil the last word. So we weren't initially going to include race and racism in this conversation, but could you give a couple of examples of similar ways in which psychiatry has enabled the continued oppression? This will be a more American conversation, this part, but
I
just
actually,
for a minute or two.
It's much bigger than America, of course.
Tell us all.
But I think, it's a especially devastating intersection between race and psychiatry. And I think if you look at the American Psychiatric Association, until very recently, its iconic foundational figure, Benjamin Rush, right, theorized psychiatry in racialized terms. There were black minds and white minds. They were understood to function differently in pathology and in health. And many generations of psychiatrists followed suit in this. Perhaps most famously is the diagnosis of drapetomania, which in the antebellum American South was used by physicians to pathologize the irrational desire of enslaved people to flee the condition of their enslavement.
Could you just say that again? Because it's pretty stunning. What was it called, this diagnosis?
So drapetomania. And the mania makes D-R-A-P-E-T-O-M-A-N-I-A. It has some Greek origins. But it is mania being a form of insanity, and drapeto having to do with specifically the context of flight, of fleeing. And now we might want to relegate this to the past, right? But then if you look in 1968, as the historian and psychiatrist Jonathan Metzl has done in a book called The Protest Psychosis, protest psychosis was a term mobilized by American psychiatrists in 1968 to take the political demonstrations of radical black activists like the Black Panthers and classify them as a special form of paranoid schizophrenia, as a pathological. So this is a medicalization to delegitimate a political action to take on structural injustice. And then in the present, I'll just say one more thing, there's the category of excited delirium. Have any of you come across this? This is a category that is very much in use today. It is a category that has not been recognized by the APA, by the DSM, by the World Health Organization, or the ICD, but it is used to describe at autopsy, to describe the cause of death, predominantly of young black men killed while in police custody, to classify the site of pathology to a form of delirium that happened in their brain that, while restrained, and that explains how and why they actually died. So it is still actively being used to legitimate institutionalized and racialized violence.
So the murdered black man is given a post-mortem psychiatric diagnosis.
Yes.
Okay, so we need something uplifting before we close and go to your question. So you get the unenviable job, Ketil. Please give us a little bit more about how psychiatry has had a liberatory role as well, and some words or thoughts for the future.
Well, that's a lot of pressure, but I think I think this discussion really raises the question of what is knowledge and what counts as knowledge. We have seen, for example, in the late 19th century, people like psychiatry taking the stories of people, their own knowledge, and turning it into pathology. Or we have seen examples of doctors using those stories for liberatory purposes, right? And the question really is who speaks for who. History, I think, shows the danger of a top-down, hierarchical, gatekeeping models of medical interactions between patients and caregivers, but also the promises of cooperation, guidance, and working as shepherds in people's lives so that they can live good lives with their different bodies and identities.
That's pretty optimistic, right? We'll go with that. And we were already in the question and answer period, so join me in thanking my colleagues, and we'll move on to Yannis, who is, please.
Thank you so much. That was truly amazing. So yeah, we're now in the Q&A. You can file your questions in the SNF Notes app, and I get dips to the first question. So I was listening to you, and you talked about some experts that were not in the line of what we now call progressive conception of what is psychiatry. So the society imposed on them the feeling to move forward. And you said that some were silently in the other side, they're disagreeing, and they didn't know how to push that forward because they were afraid of the society. So I am wondering, what is the relationship between society and science and medicine? And if society, in the end, may sometimes move science forward where scientists couldn't do that?
Sure, I can answer very shortly. I think what is scary in the current political situation is the politicization of research and science and medicine, right? And also the threats against healthcare workers trying to provide care to gender and sex minorities. So I think what we really need is associations and people to speak up to defend medical knowledge and science. Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Jeremy?
I'll just add briefly that it's in the story of the APA in the early 70s. It's remarkable how many gay psychiatrists didn't feel that they could speak up and thought it was inevitable, that there was no way this change would happen. And just to take this a bit into the present, many of us as historians of medicine have been talking for a while about the racialization of diagnosis of lung function, for example, of kidney functions. I've been teaching about it for at least 10 years, but it was only in the last couple years that just some students really took this and ran with it. I think the same thing happened in the AMA. It was a younger generation. So I just want to emphasize, with the focus on youth and mental health, with you yourself here, there's so much about actually being able to challenge what those who have been within the beast actually have taken for granted, and I want to hold on to that.
Thank you so much. So you think it still happens, this thing that was back in the 1970s?
Yeah.
Okay, now we will move on the first question from the audience.
Hello, thank you very much. My name's Julie and I'm a fundraiser, and one of the areas that we specialise in the fundraising businesses that I've got is working with the transgender community. We do a lot of work in the LGBT community generally, but particularly the trans community. And this morning I sat in a session about preventing suicide in which the word trans wasn't mentioned, which to me, LGBT was mentioned, but trans wasn't mentioned. And as any of us that have been around that field know, actually the suicide rates for the trans community are ridiculously off the charts. In the context of the fact that psychiatry hasn't always been helpful, but also in the context of the fact that we're in a world in which it seems that the leaders on the right are using the trans community to stoke up division. And actually we're seeing a rowing back of trans rights globally across the world. What do you think psychologists and the psychiatry profession can do to be an ally to the community now?
It's a great question. Yours was a great question too. I didn't mean to say otherwise. Who would like to, either one of you? Or I have some thoughts too, but.
You should start with.
Well, I was going to respond that I'm very glad you asked your question for a couple of reasons. We heard how the World Health Organization's process for changing the label, very, very welcome as of January 2022. And it's kind of ironic that at the same time that, in fact, the medical community, the psychiatric and psychological communities have made this major positive step, that at the same time we are seeing so much anti-trans political repression. I'm trying to pick my words carefully. And I don't think it's unrelated. I think that there's a backlash against a movement on the part of mental health professionals to become more and more supportive of the interests and rights and well-being of trans people. And this is terribly threatening to the communities where the notion that you could normalize, right, a lifestyle that is perceived as so wrong, unfortunately, sinful, criminal, right, is just not good. So it's almost as if, as mental health professionals are becoming more supportive and progressive and right in their approach, you see repressive communities going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I really appreciate your question. I think also history here has some guidance, and I think there is a tendency sometimes in medical communities to shed away from engagement with communities because that way kind of like only sticking to evidence-based medicine. And I think what the history I told you about from Hirschfeld is really like creating a community center, but also modifying what counts as knowledge. It actually means engaging with the people you are talking about, right? And I think there sometimes is fear in the medical communities of actually engaging with the communities that you're caring for.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there's a bit of a knife edge here, right? You're pointing out it's very important that you're raising the question of suicide, right? Because attending to gender-conforming medicine, attending to trans care saves lives, right? It's unquestionable, right? And yet mobilizing mental health information as a differential quality of trans people is also used as a repressive form, right, to justify anti-transness. So we see even in the story today, kind of the left hand and the right hand of the state, if you will. And so the question is, how can mental health professionals make sure to communicate the way that this evidence needs to be used in a positive light? And I think that's a hard thing, but it's crucial.
Okay, so I see we have time for one last question. It's in the same spirit. It will be from the SNF Nostosop. I'm sorry. It's in the same spirit, so you'll get to expand more on this. So, in which degree teen mental health is going to be impacted by the partial ban of gender-affirming care in the US? Are we going backwards instead of forwards regarding inclusivity of LGBTQ youth?
Who wants to do this one? All right?
Well, I'm not an American, so I guess I can say something without like.
You can say whatever you like.
The risk of saying something wrong.
Whatever you say will not be harsh enough. So go ahead.
I just think that always when there is, I mean, what we witnessed the last 20 years, and in the terms of trans rights in general, like and specifically, is like larger visibility, right? So we have the tipping point with William Cox on the first page of Time, and like it looked like everything was going forward, and then we witnessed like a backlash now the last 7 years or so. But I think. And it was the same thing we saw in 1933. Everything that threatens a very conservative and binary understanding of how life and bodies should look like is threatening to people. Everything that crosses boundaries, right? I mean, we can't predict future, but I think we can look to history to at least see similar backlashes when people have stepped forward.
So we have a theme going of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's very important to attend to and to anticipate the backlashes, and then to figure out how we can buffer and protect and mitigate the harm that these backlashes are going to generate. One advantage we have over 1933, I hope, is there has been some progress in moral attitudes in at least some communities of health professionals. But Jeremy, do you want the last word, and then we'll...
Well, I mean, I'm resonating with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, thinking back to the talk from President Obama last night about the differences in the world he grew up in and the world today, right? So that there has been clear and sustained progress in many fronts. One of the questions is, how do we produce sustainable change? Because what we're talking about right now is areas where when the medical profession works to try and really embrace and take on an active allyship, whether it's engaging with racialization of care, whether it's engaging with sexism in care, engaging with sexual minorities and trans care, there's this backlash and smackdown that is so strong, right? And the critique of what is being called woke medicine in the United States, which is trying to dismiss all of this work, even when we have hard evidence of lives saved, and why it makes a difference for every medical trainee. If you want to call yourself a doctor, you need to know how to engage, right? This is being called ideological. And so what I think we need to do is basically take a center here and say, this is not ideology, this is good medicine. And this is sort of a basic aspect of what one needs to do in order to be a care provider in the 21st century.
And if I could just throw in to add to that at the end, we haven't had, because it's primarily a focus on mental health, but the situation in the United States, which I fear is threatening in other countries as well, with regard to the stripping of the protection of the rights to abortion, and the same need, right, on the part of health and medical professionals globally to acknowledge this is not a matter of ideology, this is a matter of good medicine, right? Yeah. Women need access to care, trans people need access to care, gay people need access to care that is appropriate for them. This is not ideological, to underscore Jeremy's point. This is good medical care, and we need the community, everyone here who is a health professional, a mental health professional, to be part of that dialogue.